What's going on, y'all? I'm KMBest, and Second Dinner just announced that they are going to be downgrading some cards in Marvel Snap. They're going to be downgrading several cards from Series 4 into Series 3, and from Series 5 into Series 4. In this video, I'll go over my thoughts on all the downgrades, how they'll affect the metagame, and what to look for, and if you should buy any of these cards at their new price point. So, let's get started. Moving from Series 4 to Series 3 are Helicarrier, Agent Coulson, and Maria Hill. Moving from Series 5 to Series 4 are Silver Surfer, Darkhawk, Null, and Sentry. Of all 7 of these cards, the best by far, I believe, is Silver Surfer, followed by Darkhawk and Null. Silver Surfer is still a card you can build around with a relatively limited Pool 3 collection, so you can still play Sarah Surfer decks. They're not nearly as good as they were before the nerf, but they still have some real ability to surprise people with cards like Storm and Juggernaut, and generally putting more power on the board than you might expect. Now, Darkhawk himself is a lot less easy to make work in the context of the current metagame, but with the rise of Thanos, he might obtain a niche as an anti-Thanos tech card. Definitely a card to keep an eye on, but as Zabu has been nerfed, Darkhawk's power has decreased significantly now that we are no longer copying Darkhawks and Rock Slides and dumping an arbitrarily large amount of power onto the board on the final turn with Moon Girl Zabu shenanigans. Null, I think, is the card that has the potential to affect the metagame the most. Null is a card that goes in Galactus decks, and Galactus right now, he's been touted as a good investment as far as Series 4 and Series 5 cards go, because he costs 6,000 tokens, and he will presumably continue to cost 6,000 tokens based on the statements that Second Dinner has made. It is fairly likely that Null is another card that fits in the same, that is it's a very good card in the complement, as a complement to Galactus, right? And because so many people see Galactus as a good investment, but maybe they don't see Null as a good investment, this is a card that could sincerely affect the metagame if it starts costing less, which now, dropping from Series 5 to Series 4, it will cost only 3,000 tokens. As for the rest of the cards, of the remaining 4, Helicarrier, Agent Coulson, Maria Hill, and Sentry, I think that the one that works the most right now as a decent card is Agent Coulson. The other cards are a lot more niche. In the case of Sentry, it's genuinely, I think, a bad card. In the case of Helicarrier and Maria Hill, it's more, they're going to do, if you need something to do the very specific thing that they do, it's good that they exist. But if you are trying to be hyper competitive, you are unlikely to be playing those cards. So we've actually put a couple of decks together that I want to highlight for just ways you can use these cards in the future. I'm just going to go over them very quickly, and you can sort of see these are generally going to be competitively oriented. So just take a look at them, sort of see how they appeal to you, and maybe they'll help give you some ideas. I cannot vouch for all of these decks. These are just decks. Some of them are decks I've played that I like. Some of them are decks I've seen that I like. And some of them are just, oh, that looks kind of cool. You should try that out. So consider this more of an inspiration session if you open up one of these cards, if you want to see what you can do with it. Let's get into those now. So post-downgrade Darkhawk deck. This is like a pretty simple attempt to recapture the glory days of Darkhawk. We're still using Zabu, but a lot more of the deck revolves around using Moon Girl and then playing multiple She-Hulks at the end of the game. We are playing a very functional, disruptive game plan with Korg and Rockslide and Polaris and Armor. These are cards that can really impact your opponent. Shang-Chi, another card in that line. Arrow, of course, you can play an Arrow alongside a She-Hulk on turn 6 if you pass turn 5. Generally doing powerful things. Darkhawk in this deck is mostly a stat stick. He exists to be big and win lanes with his pure size and power. Now, we also have a Mr. Negative, Silver Surfer, Bast, Darkhawk deck that I've played a little bit. I actually really enjoyed playing this. I had to get over my own dislike of Psylocke, which I am sort of a known Psylocke disliker, but in this list, I think she is roughly correct. In this list, what you're doing is you're playing Zabu into an early Mr. Negative. Darkhawk, of course, is a great recipient of the Mr. Negative buff, also a great recipient of the Bast buff, and you're basically just trying to optimize your early Mr. Negatives. You have to snap and retreat a little bit differently with a deck like this than you do with other decks, but once you figure that out, you should be able to gain some cubes from it. One highlight here is Mystique. She can target Darkhawk or Iron Man, so whichever one you draw, she's going to end up pretty big. It's a good deck for Mystique. Once more on the Darkhawk train here, we have an Agent Coulson Darkhawk deck. This one is a little similar to the first deck we talked about, but we're working in some Agent Coulson, we're working in some Devil Dinosaur. Coulson wants to go with Devil Dinosaur. The general way I like to play him is he's either a complement to or a replacement for Moon Girl. So this deck uses both Coulson and Darkhawk. We're basically just putting stats on the board. We don't have a ton of interaction outside of Arrow. All we're really doing is big number go burr here. Here is a basic, if you didn't get the Silver Surfer Battle Pass and you want to pick him up now for 3,000 tokens, this is what my build of Silver Surfer after the nerfs looks like. We go back to using Storm and Juggernaut because now our overall power output is lower and we can really steal games with Storm, who I think is actually a card that's very well positioned in the current metagame. Definitely a card to keep an eye on. This build is better than people think. It's just, I think people are a little bit bored with playing this, especially after the nerf. They're playing it, they're remembering how good it used to be, and they're like, oh, I can't do this anymore. As far as what a null Galactus list looks like, this is pretty much it. The main thing you're trying to do is play Electro into Leech or Dr. Octopus into Galactus into Null. It's very difficult to beat that combination of cards. The thing you'll have to get used to by playing this deck is when you should be snapping and how you should be snapping, because a lot of the time you're pretty obviously doing something with Galactus and people aren't going to stick around to watch you beat them. They're not going to just give you free cubes when you're playing this deck. You have to be aggressive in taking them. This is a Sarah Maria Hill deck built by Wowlos, W-W-L-O-S, and I think it is the exact kind of deck that's aimed squarely at someone like me, but I'm not sure it's actually necessarily better than just playing a normal Sarah tech list. That said, if you are looking for a home for Maria Hill, you just opened her, you're like, I want to play with this card, this is a reasonable home for her. It does seem to vary heavily in power, depending on if you draw the Collector or not. A lot of the cards in this deck pump the Collector, and if they're not pumping the Collector, you're very much a Sarah tech deck. That's not a bad thing to be. One big advantage this deck has is it has other ways of discounting your cards with Quinjet and Moon Girl and Zabu. There's a lot of discounts going on. There's a lot of ways to do unfair things. But your floor is basically you are a Sarah tech deck, and your ceiling is you are a Sarah tech deck with like a 7 power Collector. That's reasonable. It's not an unreasonable thing to be doing. So if you do not want to play Galactus with Null, for example, you are going to want to play it in a different shell. This deck, I believe I saw from Den, who works for Marvel's Snap Zone. He got it from, I believe, a friend of his whose name I cannot pronounce. I am very sorry for that. The role Null serves in this deck is sort of as a second Taskmaster. The idea is you can beast your Deadpool to make him go from 1 cost to 0 cost. And because of that, you can play Deadpool and Null on the last turn. I think it's a little bit finicky, but as far as Deadpool decks go, they're kind of all finicky. If you want to play Null in something that isn't Galactus, you can try it in this. Another interaction of note with Null is you can play him with Arnim Zola. When you play Null with Arnim Zola, you play Null, well, I should say, when you play Arnim Zola on Null, the duplicated Nulls get double the power of the original Null. Finally, this is just a basic Coulson Dino deck. Tons of room to play around with here. You're just trying to get ahead, play a Dino, play an Arrow, lock your opponent out of the game. This is a time-honored archetype. It is still functional. It is still a thing you can do. It is still solid. You are still going to be okay when you play Dino. Now, you might have noticed that there are two cards that I did not cover in terms of decks here. They are Helicarrier and Sentry. The reason for this is I think Sentry really sucks. And I think Helicarrier only goes in decks that are worse versions of better decks. For example, you can play Helicarrier in sort of MODOK discard lists, but what he does is make those lists less consistent. I hate that. I cannot sit with that. Sentry used to be marginally playable when Zabu was discounting him significantly, so you could do something like Sentry and Viper on turn 4. Now I think he has gone from marginally playable in a niche scenario to totally unplayable in all scenarios. If you open this, I'm very sorry. My bad. I'm sorry for even mentioning that you could possibly open this card. Obviously, do not buy it. Now, as far as whether any of these cards are worth the purchase, I think the card that is most likely to be worth the purchase is Silver Surfer, followed by Null if you have Galactus. Of course, if you have Galactus and want to play a bunch of Galactus, Null's a great purchase. As far as the rest of these, Darkhawk is much more niche than he was only a few weeks ago, and none of the other cards are cards you should be focusing on, in my opinion. Now, that doesn't mean they aren't good. That just means you're fine to wait. You'll be okay waiting on these cards to open naturally out of your caches. Once again, this has been KMBest. This is my breakdown of the most recently announced series downgrades in Marvel Snap. I will see you on the next one. Remember to like, subscribe, all those things. Smash that like button. Turn notifications on. Do all the things that make me feel good when I watch the dopamine. When like my dopamine numbers go up, it goes great. It goes great. I got excited just thinking about it. So thank you so much. I'll see you on the next one.